The CONFEX webinar series always throws up some interesting discussion points, but I assure you, today's interview is something else. Getting heard in Westminster, and we're about to speak to Alastair Campbell. Live from Royal Lancaster, London with Smart AV. Welcome to the CONFEX webinar series. Now, before we introduce today's guest, here is a quick film from our sponsor, Skyline Whitespace. Now, as is the way with these things, of course, we want the audience to be engaged. And as you're viewing this through the prism of Zoom, you'll see the Q&A function there at the bottom. We want to hear your questions, and we'll make time for those at the end. Please do keep it clean. All right? I'll be the one moderating those. But today, to introduce the guest. He is a man who needs no introduction, but we have to do one, otherwise it just looks weird. I'm delighted to introduce Alastair Campbell, writer, mental health campaigner, and of course, former Director of Communications to Tony Blair. Alastair, are you keeping well?
Oh, God, that is existential at the moment, that one. I'm well-ish, I'd say.
Well-ish.
I'm finding lockdown 2 harder than lockdown 1.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult, but hopefully now we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but still in the tunnel we are, but at least we know we're coming out the other side. Now, just to get things fired off with perhaps a little bit more heated context, I'm just curious really for your personal appraisal on how the government has handled this pandemic through the prism of supporting businesses and the people.
I mean, look, you won't be surprised to know, I think, that I don't think they've handled it very well at all. I think that what you have to do in a crisis, and I accept this is a genuine crisis, it's been very, very difficult for the government, for every government around the world. But I think you've got to be very, very clear and open and honest with the public right from the word go. And I think both here and in the States, we have had in the States until recently, but certainly still have here, leaders who, you know, they're driven far too much by describing the world as they want it to be, as opposed to how it really is. And so I think at the start that they just were way too slow, one, to get on top of the specific health issue, and therefore the economic consequences are perhaps going to play out even more worse than they otherwise would have done. So I can't pretend to be impressed, and I think a lot of it is because there isn't, you know, I look in from the outside, and I hate doing this because I've never wanted to be one of those, you know, wouldn't have happened in my day kind of thing. But you sort of just see a lack of grip, and it just feels like they're making it up day to day. So I find it very, very frustrating.
I know you said you don't want to kind of like dwell too much on hindsight, but I've already got it down on my list of questions, I'm afraid. I'm just curious, you know, had you been in this position, you know, under Tony Blair, is there anything top line that you guys would have done differently?
I mean, it's hard to know, you know, because you don't see all the stuff that they see. You don't see all the data as it's coming in. You're not able maybe to make the judgments. But I felt from the word go, and look, the thing about any crisis is that first bit is so important. And, you know, don't forget, Johnson was the guy who stood up and said, you know, if there's got to be one country who stands up against this and basically says we're not going to, you know, bow down to this pandemic, then let it be the United Kingdom. And I was getting messages from sort of, you know, leaders around Europe that I still speak to, and some of whom I work with, saying, you know, what is this guy on? So that was where the mistake. So I hope that if Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or in fact Cameron or May had been Prime Minister, that they'd have just been more serious about it. And, you know, right through the whole thing, he's just not serious about what's at stake. It's all like it's a big game. And I think that when you've got all the kind of the consequences, economic, health, kids' education, university sector, there's so much at stake. And then the very, very minimum that I think we're entitled to is serious, sober leadership. Absolutely.
And I think this is where a lot of frustration in the events and experience industry is sort of born from, I guess. And I suppose one of the overriding feelings or emotions in our sector, the £84 billion industry, is that it does feel left behind. And I guess in part that comes down to the fact that we're not sure the government has defined our industry. We don't know what it is. And standardised industrial classification codes, people, our audience will probably know, is something I've been banging on about quite often, because that's the only logical reason I can see. And there just is insufficient codes to define what the industry sort of is. So my question to you really is, how does a government define an industry? How does it identify what it's dealing with?
Well, my answer would be actually to kind of reframe the way you put that. When you said that the government doesn't define the industry clearly, then my immediate instinct is to say, but you should be defining the industry clearly. The industry should be defining the industry clearly. And that definition should be so clear and compelling and overwhelming that government responds to you, as opposed to you having to sort of sit there and hoping that government kind of, notices. So how do they, they obviously, there are, you look at the way, for example, that, technology is changing so fast. So they've, back when we started, you wouldn't have had any part of government that was dealing in, environmental job creation, for just to take one example, or regional economy being boosted by the devolution process. These are all kind of relatively new things. So that sort of analytical work, you're adapting to it all the time. But I would say, as a bit of kind of, free advice on this, is you have to take the lead in defining who and what you are. So even when you say to me something like the X billion events industry, okay, when you say that, if I then go back at you and say, what does that consist of? Right, well, you've got to be able to go, if you're talking to government, bang, 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 and that's why it matters to you. So I think if you look at which are the industries that you feel the government has kind of, when the pandemic started, where were the industries where they thought, oh my God, we better watch out for that, we better watch out for that, better watch out for that. I bet you if you track it back, you'll find it will be a mixture of the ones that have got massive brand names, airlines, being an obvious example, retail because, the high street, massive brand names, or it will be where industries are very well organized. And I think that I've spoken at some of your events before, and I think that it's not criticism of this, but I think one of the problems with the makeup of your industry is that it's so disparate. Now that's actually, in a good time, that's one of your strengths. But when it comes to a really tough time like this, where you want a voice at the table of government and you want help and you want support and you want to be recognised for what you do for the economy, then it becomes a weakness.
That's really interesting because, as a quite remarkable episode of collaboration, we have sort of started to work towards that. There's been the creation of something called One Industry, One Voice, which has, so far been a very humbling experience. And that has brought about the umbrella, I guess, over multiple other events industry campaigns, such as We Make Events, Let the Music Play, and the new one that's coming out, which is We Create Experiences. And the purpose is to inspire people to book their events for 2021, to make them fall in love with events again. But a lot of the agencies that do actually run with or run events for some the biggest brands in the world. Every engagement or experience is related to some manner of big brand. So I think we're on the right step. But I guess then what you're saying is there isn't really an arbitrary kind of accountant's balance sheet that says, right, this industry is that and that is what we see.
No, because it evolves all the time. And the reason why I mention the point about large brands, and of course by brands I don't just mean companies. So if you've got a situation where the economy is kind of centre stage, the way I put it is like this: imagine that you're the Chancellor's or the Business Secretary's diary secretary, okay? Imagine that that's your point of connection and they're the person that you're going to. So if you've got the build up to some major economic event, I don't know if it's changed now because famously, our glorious leader said the F word about business. But let's assume that the Chancellor doesn't think that. I would reckon in the run-up to a budget, if the CBI put a call through to his diary secretary saying, that would like to send in a delegation meeting, I reckon that's going to go in the diary. That she's not even he or she, the diary secretary, is not even going to go to see him and say, we'll just put 20 minutes, half an hour in the diary. That's kind of where you've got to be. So, brilliant that you're doing your One Industry, One Voice. definitely the right place to go. But as that develops and evolves, it has to have a profile as well. Because if it's just made up of all these big competing different brands from different sectors, then the voice of the organisation that you want to be the contact to government, that is necessarily going to be weakened. So, you know, think about how you build that into a coherent voice that when you or whoever's representing it is in contact with the political process, be that government, backbench MPs, opposition, whatever it might be, they're going to take your call. Because that is the only way, ultimately, you're going to influence them. You can influence them, obviously, as well through the public debate. But when you come out, for example, with these figures on the events industry, you've got to find really compelling ways of connecting those to the debate. Figures just go like that with people. You know, 1 billion, 20 billion, 50 billion, 90 billion, 135 billion. In the end, they're numbers. You've got to build campaigns around what those numbers mean to communities and, crucially, at a time like this, to the government.
Absolutely. Now,
You've got to do a bit of their work for them.
that does not surprise me at all. Now, obviously, this week, for those looking in online, you may have obviously heard that the events industry has been given, I'll call it an amber light, that it can get cracking again once the national lockdown emerges. And I'll just give you the quick update. And of course, it was notable that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, did actually mention business events in his Commons address, which was a big moment for us. But it says, as part of the winter plan, large events, including business events and sport events, live performances, will be allowed to run in Tier 1 and 2 areas. In Tier 1, up to 4,000 people will be allowed to gather outdoors, or 50%, whichever is lower. That drops to 1,000 in an indoor setting. In Tier 2, the outdoor capacity drops to 2,000, 1,000 indoors, or 50%, whichever is lower. And no events at all will be allowed to run in any Tier 3 area. So, in a manner of speaking, for us, that's some manner of progress. It certainly gives our client base a footing of confidence, although we know we're not really going to be, running events any time before Christmas. But now we've sort of...
Can I just jump in there?
Go ahead.
You are going to also, though, adapt. So, for example, I was doing an event the other day, which was a bit like this. In fact, it wasn't even like this. I was doing it from my desk at home. And the people I was doing it for, they run an annual conference, okay? And at the end, we had a little chat, and they were saying, you know what, we're thinking maybe we'll keep it like this. And I thought, that's interesting. Why is that? We said, well, last year we had 200, and this year we got 600. And so, that I just thought that's quite interesting. They may do that or they may not. Now, that will, of course, mean that you don't necessarily get a lot that goes with an event, but it's a part of your industry that's saying, we're not just going to wait for things to get back to what they were, because they're not going to get back to that for quite a long time, I think. We're going to adapt.
I think that's a very reasonable thing to say. I think the only point I'd counter with is that a lot of people who have, I hate the expression pivoted to an online setting this year, have got a captive audience that have been under lockdown, have been at home.
For sure.
I think once you're back in an office setting, of course that may change long term as well, are you going to take time out of your conventional working day to join events as well? So there is still a groundswell of demand for live experiences, and I don't think that they're going to go away. I think that actually connecting, being face to face, we've all taken it for granted, and I think this lockdown has made us really kind of appreciate that. But I think we're not going to necessarily have to work harder when live comes back. We're going to have to work smarter. We're going to have to engage that online audience, but we still have to have an event rooted in live. You and I could do this over Zoom, chatting. Would it be the same? No, I'm actually enjoying the occasion of coming here and making use of this studio and being face to face with you.
No, I agree. There's no. Listen, I've got 2 events out of the house today. And it was so nice getting out and coming here and just thinking, I'll be seeing people. I love my missus and I love my dog, but we have spent a lot of time together, and it's just quite nice to get out and see you.
And with respect, my wife's got a newborn at home, and I am sorry, I will be home shortly, okay? I know you're doing a fantastic job without me.
She's really not watching.
Oh, I hope she is. They're always coming. But my main question really was going to be is that now we've seen to have, made, the first pigeon steps of sort of progress, and, we've got Brexit back on the agenda. How do we sort of get the era government to become a more central pillar as part of industrial strategy for UK PLC?
You've got to build a case, and you've got to build the case from a right from the base. I'll tell you what happens with these situations. Right, you live within an industry. You know the people. You all talk to each other all the time. You're all kind of across each other's business, and that's great. And you all do it well and fine. But I think what happens is that you imagine that other people have a sense of it, when a lot of the time they don't. So you have to build that. And that means, maybe the industry has done this in the past. I don't know. But I think I said this the last time I spoke at one of your events. I never had a sense when I was working alongside Tony Blair, or in the way that I had a sense of the car industry, the aviation industry, the energy companies, whatever. You had a sense of them. I never had a sense. I had lots. You had a sense of football clubs, right, which you would put into part of events, presumably, right?
Absolutely.
So you had a sense of them. You had a sense of festivals, book festivals, right? Not least because they're constantly asking you to go and talk at them and stuff. But that sort of the whole being bigger than the parts, that I never had a sense of that. Now, you could say, well, government should have a sense of that because, we're really important to the government. But I would say, I think you have to build that case from ground up. And actually, when you've got a crisis like this, when you've got a situation where so much is up in the air and it's all going to fall down in very, very strange play out in very strange ways afterwards, it's a very good time to do it. So when you take those figures that you put out there, and people will know them or don't know them, but actually the bigger question is, what do they mean? And how do you use them to persuade opinion formers, policymakers, that you matter? And only when you do that as a collective, where you really try to put the competitiveness aside for a bit and say, okay, we know you care about this and you care about that, and we're not in we're in slightly different worlds, but if we are to call ourselves the events industry, what does that mean for government? What does that mean for the media? What does that mean for the public? And then build a campaign. That's the only way you can do it.
Well, that feels we're being validated, because I think that's what we are working towards. And I think you're absolutely spot on. The events industry is a horizontal, I guess, across all these other sectors. Everything else is there. And I remember before I joined this industry, I used to work in motorsport, and it was effectively running events. And at no point did I ever think I was part of the events industry. Exactly. It was motorsport. And you go to a car exhibition or something like that, you don't see events necessarily. You see automotive. I think we spend our time growing other industries. Maybe we neglect ourselves, and that's something that perhaps we need to address. Yeah,
and I think that's a good way of thinking of it. And of course, if you are the motorsports industry, which is an extraordinary kind of British success story as much as anything else, and it's got global reach, you don't want to lose that. But at the same, and that's why I say you have to maybe sometimes put the competitiveness aside and say, right, well, how do we? You want to be having a conversation with the motorsports industry, say, how do we make you part of us? And do that in a way that they don't feel threatened by that. And that, I think, could be quite an exciting project.
Absolutely. Well, someone make a note of that, for goodness sake, please. That was great advice. Okay, so I want to move on now to intra-government communication, because there's been some extraordinary situations developing this year. It has been quite remarkable. And I think the events industry, we're chatting before we sort of came on air, that the events industry as we see it essentially breaks down into two bits. You've got music, culture, sport events on one side, very generally consumer, public focused, public friendly, and on the other side, business events, which are key economic pillars, backbone, conference, trade show exhibitions, and so on. We're all lumped into the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and this is not a stain on any individual whatsoever. There's some people working fantastically hard behind the scenes, but there have been incidents this year where the government, central government, has made an announcement of this, that or the other. The DCMS haven't known about it, so we've gone for clarification. They haven't been sure themselves, and it's sometimes taken up to a week for the DCMS to actually confirm with central government what is and what isn't allowed. And that to me just says that there's communication breakdown within Westminster itself.
Well, as I said earlier, I don't like to say it wouldn't have happened in my day, but that feels pretty grim to me. If you're saying that really significant announcements that are impinging upon...
Significant in our context,
exactly.
In the events industry.
Yeah, but you see, that I think actually underlines what I've been saying to you. They shouldn't be doing that without having a sense of, if we do that without telling them, they are going to be justifiably very, very pissed off. So we won't do it, we'll tell them. That's what I find extraordinary about that. Now, I do have a sense that a lot of basic competence is not there. I think a lot of that's down to the ministers. They love blaming the civil servants, but I think a lot of that is down to lack of grip of ministers. But the honest, straight answer to your question is that should not happen. But it will happen where you talk about intra-government. One of the things I think we did with Labour pretty well was actually get much greater cross-coordination in government. You can't function as a government unless you have that. It's all very well, and again, anybody who's in a big industry knows this, or a big company. If everybody just sits in their silo and thinks nothing outside their own little kind of tunnel that they're in, then there are people who are affected by the ripples coming out of there. They have to be taken into account. But you would be taken into account if you had that proper, organised, loud, lobbying voice that's kind of in their ear the whole time. I mean, that is unforgivable. If there were big announcements that affected your industry being announced and one part of government did not know when it clearly had an impact on both departments' clients, for want of a better word, that's unforgivable.
Yeah, it was. It has caused frustration, and the trade associations that operate within the event sphere have worked kind of incredibly hard. And I think, perhaps in some corners they feel that DCMS is not the right department for them. In context to where we are, Department for Culture, Media, Sport, but we're talking about a business event setting here. Given what the industry is all about, it is the belief that we should be more aligned to the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Is it possible for us to perhaps request a change of sponsorship? Or I don't know how it works.
Yeah, you could. You'd have to build a case for that. And that may be, by the way, when you get into the developing your strategy as one industry, one voice, it may be that that's one of the kind of objectives you set. But then you do, would you think, for example, something like the Premier League, massive global brand, very successful British product, would you think that is a business responsibility or a sport? I mean, it feels right in sport because it's sport. So you may have to take on some really quite difficult arguments like that. But I think that for this kind of stuff, and I've done loads and loads and loads of conferences, and I didn't know until I actually left government, if I'm being frank, I didn't know until I left government and actually doing lots of conferences became part of my new kind of life and livelihood and everything else, I had no idea of the scale of it. So you could say, well, you weren't doing your job properly because you should have known. But I could say, yeah, but if you're sitting there at the central government, you've got a lot of people trying to get your attention. So it's a competitive place where you should have been in there fighting as well.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. And that sort of leads me on to the question of the role that national media plays in this, because, at Mash Media, we've been sort of the belief that, government's there, we know we need to get their attention to a point, but we believe that real change comes from the pressure elicited by the media, starting at a local level, because I assume, or would hope, that all local MPs read their local or regional press. They need them on side for their own voter base. But maybe you can confirm or deny, how much influence can the media help us leverage over government?
Yeah, they can, but I still wouldn't rule out before you even think of the media and the role that they're going to play, get the strategy fixed first. Now the media, how you then communicate that in part through the media will be a very big tactical question, but that strategy is the important bit. So if you think, now I think this is a government that is interesting. I think sometimes you can you can spot the reality of a government from some of the criticisms it makes of others. So like, for example, I look at Johnson and I look back when he was on the Telegraph, the stuff he used to write about us, for example, you know, obsessed by the next day's headline, only care about spin, cronyism, all this sort of stuff. You know, I think, oh, yeah, I can now watch him, and it's like, it almost feels to me like the stuff that he used to say about us, which I didn't think was terribly effective, he was actually talking about what he sort of government he might like to run. So I think this is I think a very, very media influenced government. Look at, you know, one recent example, Marcus Rashford. Now, okay, Marcus Rashford and the school meals, he's Marcus Rashford and he's a top footballer and he can get coverage for stuff if he does things like that. But he'll only get the coverage if he'll get a coverage day one just for standing up and saying it, but it only penetrates and works if it's then thought through, properly strategic, with a plan behind it, and you build support. And it's, you know, part of me finds it that it's almost ridiculous actually that you had the whole of the Labour Party banging on about this, but in the end it took a footballer, okay? It took a footballer because that's what made it interesting for the media, and it took the media to make the government think, oh my God, we've ballsed up here. So they are important, but not as important as the strategy. But I'll tell you what, once you've got a strategy, if you get a few of the newspapers and the broadcasters on side, it helps.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a second. But do you think, really, it's a bit off script, I guess, but the departure of Dominic Cummings and the other communications aide, do you think that might elicit some more positive change in government? Do you think Johnson was maybe held captive perhaps too much in that area?
It's very hard for me to know because I don't, you know, the honest answer is I don't know. What I hear, because I mean, obviously having worked in government for as long as we did, I know lots of people who are still there. And certainly the very strong impression I had was that Johnson and Gove pretty much allowed them to run riot. Well, you can't do that. You cannot have a situation in our system of government where the elected Prime Minister and his right-hand man politically, Michael Gove, in the Cabinet Office, have this guy to whom they feel so beholden he can do what the hell he wants. That was always going to hit the buffers, and it's hit the buffers probably quicker than Cummings thought it would. Will it change things? I mean, look, the Priti Patel not getting the boot, the dumping of a manifesto commitment on international aid, they've happened post-Cummings. You know, I think Johnson was maybe using Cummings. A lot of people think Cummings was using Johnson. I think Johnson may have been using Cummings to sort of take a lot of the flack for who and what he is. So I don't know is the answer. I don't know. I thought it was one of the worst points of that whole escapade was that Johnson honestly thought that Lee Kane, who was the communications director, as I understand it, should become his chief of staff. Well, I would say the communications on COVID has been an utter shambles. So I would say that whoever was in charge of that has probably not got the skills that you're going to need to be a chief of staff. So if it should change, but if it will, I've got no idea.
We wait and see. Returning to the sort of matter of the media, obviously, you know, one of the constant rhetoric throughout this whole pandemic from the events industry has been they felt that the national media hasn't really picked up their plight. And I know that you could go to probably any industry and they'd all say the same thing, but we're talking about an £84 billion sector. We know we've tried to rally that point home, that number home, and yet so little of that has been covered in context. And there's been a lot of sort of people power movements to try and gain attention. Not just to media, but to government as well. Do things like Twitter storms and mass emailers to broadcasters and, you know, silent protests on Parliament Square, do things like that actually break through? Do people really pay attention?
Well, well, the answer to that is they sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And some people do and some people don't. And you can never be quite sure is the truth. But put it this way, when I said earlier about get the strategy before you go to the tactics, they are tactics, okay? So do you go and have a protest? Do you bombard the Today programme and Kay Burley and GMB with emails saying we want to come on your programme? You can do that, that's fine. But unless that email says something that's going to connect with them, then you're probably wasting your breath. And then, I look at that guy, you mentioned Brexit. That guy, Steve Bray, do you know the guy with the big blue hat who wanders around Parliament Square?
I've had the pleasure of a very short conversation with him.
He's a good bloke, I like him a lot. But the thing is that he's just the bloke with a blue hat, right? Now, okay, I was part of the People's Vote campaign and ultimately we lost, but, we got bloody close. And when you say, did Twitter Storm work, does this work, does that work, does that work? We did all of that stuff. And we didn't win the campaign, but in terms of building the profile of the campaign, those things all worked. And I do say, I think he's an interesting guy, that, because, he has made a difference in that debate. Now, people could say, well, what does he do? Just shouts at the telly all day. But I'm not sure. I think he's got a consistent message that he just keeps banging out. And he's developed a profile, and it's just an interesting little model, that. I'm not suggesting you wear a black hat and a coat, but a blue hat and a coat, but I think don't rule out any of these things. And the other thing I would say to you is that sometimes you can be very, very surprised in the campaigning space about what cuts through and what doesn't. So once you've got that strategy clear, this is why I love the idea that, work hard on the strategy, and once you've got that, and you're clear about what it is you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it, and what your big arguments are, you can then be absolutely infinitely varied. So all those things, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, 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 yes, all of them, provided that you know where it fits into a strategy.
It's about individual people then. You need figureheads, faces, and you need them to know where they're going, rather than just, a wall of 700,000 people. Correct.
And you also need, so back to the motor industry example, right, I'm not a big motorsports fan, but let's say I know that some people just, Formula One is kind of like the big thing in their life. So every time there's a Grand Prix, it's massive for a lot of people right around the world. Have you ever thought, for example, about, again, during the pandemic, would it be a good time to do this? How many live interviews are done on media around the world by well-known faces in that sport, right? One of them saying on Eurosport, Sky, whatever it might be, that, it's fantastic to be here. And, it just shows you that even with the pandemic, what the events industry can put on with all the people, that kind of thing will have, provided it's tied into a broader strategy that's going on different fronts. And you might then find, actually, you get to one of these really big guys like Lewis Hamilton or one of these guys, or, when, let's say you get a massive boxing match on, right? I mean, I've got a lot of experience of this from, one of the kind of craziest periods of my time in Number 10 was when, do you remember when the government banned Mike Tyson from coming over? Do you remember that one? Right, and then we unbanned it after a while. But the point is that the arguments that swayed us in the end was actually, and fair play to him, it was Frank Warren, the promoter, who sent me, he got a load of economists together and they did a real proper analysis of, and okay, they skewed it to show this is really good for Manchester, I think it was Manchester, but they did a huge analysis of the economic impact on a region of a big world heavyweight title fight, right? And the numbers were mind-blowing. So if you could say, the next time Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, whatever, you get one of them to talk about the events industry, right? You're in business.
Sounds good. Well, in that case, I'll draw all your attention to the We Create Experiences campaign, and you'll see a series of some celebrity clips popping up already. I think we've already had Harvey Goldsmith. There might be a new one coming out today. Right, we're going to move on to audience questions in just a tick, but I believe we have a poll first, which I believe should be popping up on your screens. There
Brexit,
it is.
0 points.
No. I'm afraid you can take 5 for just a second. Okay, so we're interested now, after the government announcement regarding the tiered system, how will you run events in December and January? Keep the same physical format on reduced numbers, look at doing a virtual physical hybrid event, go fully virtual, or cancel or postpone until next year. Submit your answers now, please, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know what I suppose I have to click as well. I'll cancel and postpone because I'm just to be controversial. Oh, I can't.
Are these live?
Okay, right. Are the results available? Not too revealing. Go fully virtual seems to be the most popular. 36% of you think that staying online between now and the new year is the way to go. Some of you, 29%, will be doing a hybrid iteration. 24% cancel or postpone until 2021. And 11% of you will keep the same physical format with reduced numbers. Interesting results. Okay, right, Alastair, let's move on to some audience questions. Now, I've no idea what's here. But I've got one for my own self first.
Yeah.
Can Burnley stay up this year?
Yes.
That's it, just one word answer.
Well, the question was, can they stay up? Yes is the answer. Provided we're not in the bottom 3 at the end of the season. Do you like my shoes, by the way? These are the Burnley official shoes.
Are they?
Claret laces, claret sole, and inside the club crest through the lining.
Very nice. Should have worn mine.
Anyway, we've not had a great start to the season, but yeah, we can stay up.
I was told to wear my Wimbledon kit today, but I was told not to. Okay, right, first question. We've got one from Sean Hines, who is the CEO at Manchester Central, which is actually currently a Nightingale hospital up in the northwest, which is going to be in tier 3 when we come out of lockdown. The government and the opposition attend their party conferences. Isn't it odd that they don't recognise that as business events? I mean, those party conferences are huge, big earners.
Well, no, I'll tell you this. They do recognise them as events. But this is the point that I was making to you earlier. If you're the government or the opposition and you've got your party conference, you see it as your party conference. I mean, governments are doing big events all the time. I go back to the point I keep banging on about. You've got to make them understand that that's what they're doing. I can remember, I'll tell you another really tough time when we were in government was when we decided as the Labour Party that we weren't going to Blackpool. Because, people thought the hotels weren't quite as good as they used to be and we needed more space and there'd been a lot of complaints about some, logistics and all that stuff. And that was really, really difficult because I think we had a sense of, taking away from a town that was, had lots of other reasons to struggle, taking away a very important part of its existence. So it's a very fair point. But I go back to my point. It's a point that you should be making to them all the time.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got another question here from James Niche. I'm deciding what these are on the fly, so here we go. Interesting how Alastair says Boris Johnson when he used to write for The Telegraph about criticism. Is it a question of politicians can't be trusted or say one thing from the outside but act differently when inside government, perhaps because things are always easier said than done? Is that a fair reflection?
Well, I think things are definitely easier said than done. I mean, having been a journalist myself, I know that it's a lot easier to sit on the outside and, and I guess that's what I do at Johnson now. I kind of, sort of rather helplessly lob a few ideas and thoughts and insults at him and hope he goes away, which he won't for a while. But no, I think the difference I feel with Johnson, I wish he'd changed more, actually, is the truth. I wish he had changed more from that persona that he was as a journalist. But I worry that he actually hasn't changed much at all. He still thinks it's about the next day's papers, it's the next story, it's the next headline, it's the next phrase, it's the next picture, as opposed to, this is what I want to do for the country. And I can sense you don't want me to bang on about Brexit.
I don't mind.
But that to me is like, yesterday, how can we have a situation where yesterday the Chancellor is standing up there in the House of Commons setting out some really difficult things for the country to do in the economic context of COVID without literally without even mentioning Brexit, which is probably the most defining event of this generation, right? COVID will, hopefully be gone before too long, and it will, I'm not saying it's not been a huge event, it has, but in terms of the overall lasting impact on this country, Brexit, hugely significant. And you have a spending statement from Chancellor yesterday, doesn't even mention it. That's a game, they're playing a game. And the game at the moment is when things go absolutely T.S up in future with Brexit, they'll say, oh, it was all down to COVID. That's what it's all about. They're playing the game. And Johnson played games as a journalist and he's playing games as Prime Minister, and I'm afraid the country's the pawn.
And that's an interesting thing, because I think we've already had, even before COVID kicked off on our shores, already seen evidence that some major congresses, we're talking about huge congresses that see, tens of thousands of people descend on any one city, already maybe exploring our international competitors. Frankfurt, for example, huge competitor to London, and particularly for our industry, that's a big, big hit to take.
Well, I'll tell you, during the summer, I did a little sort of tour. My Fiona and I drove around Europe, and we actually became a thing of asking every single person we met whether they could see any upside to Brexit from the British perspective. These are all foreigners, okay, Europeans, and not one. Nobody could understand it. But if you just think about it, if you're one of these, let's say the European Car Manufacturers Association, right? And you're thinking about having a conference, a new event, right? Where are you going to pick at the moment? Now, last 2 years ago, London, Birmingham, Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, they'd all have been in the mix. They're not now.
I have a horrible feeling you're right there. Now, we've got a question here from our good friend, anonymous attendee, who seems to pop up at all of our events these days. He's one of our biggest fans. And it's an interesting one, a cynical, but an interesting one. And it reads, do you think that they've allowed events to go ahead, which of course technically they are from next week, even if we can't get actually any of them going, so they don't have to look at any specific funding or support measures? By just saying, look, well, we will let you running events, despite the fact that there's actually no demand for them before Christmas. So therefore, they don't have to offer any extended financial support packages or anything along those lines.
No, I hope not, is the answer to that. I hope not. I hope it's kind of genuinely motivated because they understand, one, the need for the industry to get back in, with a bit of wind in its sails, but also the need for people to be able to get out there and do things other than, sit and look at their fireplace, which I spend a lot of my time doing. So I think that, no, I hope not. I hope not is the answer to that. I think they do recognise, they obviously want to get back to some sort of normality. But I think that all of these questions in a way are saying to me that they're underlining this thing about, you've got a big opportunity at the moment, I think, to be persuading them how much you fit into what is their coming strategy. Because, getting the country back to some sort of normality, well, there's nothing more normal than going to a football match, nothing more normal than, going to a book festival, nothing more normal than going to a wedding, whatever, these are the things that you have to get into their noggins. That's what you do. And that means that what you say to them about their priorities as a government have to get listened to and have to get heard.
I'm absolutely sensing the theme. And I think, to be honest, a lot of these questions are asking the same thing. We've covered it already, but I think maybe with our dying minutes, maybe we can come up with some sort of articulate answer for these guys. And it's from Steve Monington, who's actually one of the contributors to Exhibition News magazine. Is part of our problem in being heard that business exhibitions belong to the wrong government department. DCMS, he says, is about fun rather than trade. How do we move to a more relevant department that understands us, such as BEIS? We did touch on this earlier, but is there any sort of cut out and keep advice?
I hadn't thought of that, but I would say, as you're putting this strategy together, in a sense, you don't want to lose the sense of culture, media, sport as a kind of big thing. I've always felt media, by the way, should be in business. But if you could persuade the big sporting authorities that it would be in their interest to be in business as well, then I think you're onto something. And I think the arts, the arts becomes, if you like, culture, and the arts becomes a department, which I think is a perfectly good thing to be. But it feels to me like you are a much better fit inside a business department. And the trouble is, governments are very good, even a government as incompetent as this one is probably quite good at letting people fall through the cracks. Because you've got to remember, the other thing you've got to remember about every single Prime Minister, Chancellor, Government Minister, every single one of them, every single day, gets asked by somebody for money, right? They get told by somebody, but listen, you need to understand how important we are. Now, what that does is it develops in you the ability to kind of push back. The only thing that will get through that pushback is an absolutely cast iron solid argument that they can't afford to ignore.
And that, I think, is a fantastic line to end on. Alastair, thank you so much. This has been
Pleasure.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, join us again next week, Thursday at 4 p.m, where, funnily enough, we will be discussing One Industry, One Voice. You'll have my face to contend with, I'm afraid, but I'll be joined by Rick Stainton, the Group Executive Director of Smile, and Simon Hughes, the Chair of the Business Visits and Events Partnership. Once again, thank you to Royal Lancaster London and Smart AV, and of course, Skyline Whitespace, our sponsors. Thank you so much for stopping by. Thank you.